Picture this: the Mediterranean world, 3,200 years ago, a time of thriving empires, bustling trade, and flourishing civilizations. Then, seemingly overnight, everything changed. Cities burned, kingdoms crumbled, and entire cultures vanished from history. At the heart of this chaos stood a mysterious group known only as the Sea Peoples. They left no monuments, no written records, not even a clear name for themselves. Yet their impact was so profound that they reshaped the ancient world in ways we're still trying to understand today. Who were these shadowy warriors? Where did they come from? And how did they manage to bring some of the greatest empires of the Bronze Age to their knees? The story of the Sea Peoples is like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Ancient texts from Egypt and the Near East speak of their terrifying raids, fleets of ships appearing without warning, armies sweeping inland with unmatched ferocity. The Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms of its time, collapsed under their onslaught. Egypt, though it survived, was left battered and weakened. Entire cities were abandoned, trade networks dissolved, and a dark age descended over the region for centuries. Yet despite all this devastation, the Sea Peoples themselves remain shrouded in mystery. They were the ultimate ghost attackers, striking hard and then vanishing into the fog of history, leaving behind only questions. This is a tale of intrigue, of civilizations rising and falling, of a forgotten chapter in human history that still echoes today. Were the Sea Peoples refugees fleeing some greater catastrophe? Were they opportunistic raiders or something far more organized? Over the centuries, historians and archaeologists have pieced together clues, scattered inscriptions, charred ruins, fragments of pottery, each one a tiny window into this ancient enigma. And as we'll see, the answers might be even stranger than the legends. So join us as we journey back to the twilight of the Bronze Age to unravel one of history's most enduring mysteries: the rise and fall of the Sea Peoples. The late Bronze Age was a golden era of interconnected civilizations, where trade routes stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia and beyond, carrying everything from spices to precious metals. Kings exchanged letters written on clay tablets, diplomats brokered alliances, and artists shared ideas across vast distances. Then, in what seems like the blink of an eye, this vibrant world unraveled. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the great palaces of the Mycenaeans were reduced to ashes. The mighty Hittite Empire, which once rivaled Egypt, crumbled into oblivion. Even Egypt, though it endured, barely survived the storm. The question that haunts historians is simple yet profound: what went wrong? Some point to the Sea Peoples as the primary destroyers, citing Egyptian reliefs that depict fierce battles against mysterious invaders arriving by sea. But was it really that straightforward? Modern archaeology reveals a more complex picture. Climate records suggest prolonged droughts may have devastated agriculture, while earthquakes could have shattered cities already strained by overpopulation and political unrest. The truth is, the collapse of the Bronze Age wasn't caused by a single villain. It was a perfect storm of disasters, both natural and man-made. The Sea Peoples didn't emerge in a vacuum. They may have been desperate migrants displaced by famine or war, pushed to raid richer lands just to survive. Or perhaps they were skilled mercenaries, taking advantage of the chaos to carve out new territories for themselves. What makes this period so fascinating is how eerily familiar it feels. Societies at their peak, seemingly invincible, only to collapse under the weight of interconnected crises. Doesn't that sound hauntingly modern? The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse isn't just about ancient history. It's a reminder that even the greatest civilizations are fragile, dependent on stable climates, functioning economies, and cooperative neighbors. The Sea Peoples may have been the spark, but the fire was already waiting to burn. The walls of Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Ramses III's mortuary temple, are like a 3,000-year-old newsreel carved in stone. Here, in vivid detail, we see the first and most dramatic glimpses of the Sea People's ships locked in combat, warriors with horned helmets, and chaotic scenes of invasion. The inscriptions boast of Egypt's victory, calling the invaders the foreign countries who came from the islands in the midst of the sea. But that's all we get. No names, no homelands, just a vague label and terrifying imagery. It's as if the Egyptians themselves didn't fully understand who they were fighting, only that these attackers came from somewhere beyond the horizon, bringing fire and chaos with them. What makes these records so frustrating and so fascinating is what they leave out. The carvings show the Sea Peoples arriving in ox-drawn carts with their families, suggesting they weren't just raiders but entire communities on the move. Some scholars believe this points to a mass migration, a desperate flight from famine or war in their homelands. Others argue the detailed depictions of their weapons and ships hint at a highly organized military force, possibly mercenaries or even a confederation of displaced kingdoms. The Egyptians described them as relentless, writing, "No land could stand before their arms." Yet for all their fear, the pharaoh's scribes never bothered to record where these enemies came from or why they attacked. Was it deliberate omission, or did even Egypt, the superpower of its day, simply not know? One clue might lie in the names Ramses did record. The inscriptions list groups like the Peliset, who later settled in Canaan and may have become the Philistines of biblical fame. There were the Shekelesh, possibly from Sicily, and the Lucca, linked to the coast of modern Turkey. But these are just fragments, like pieces of a broken vase we're trying to glue back together without knowing its original shape. The irony is thick. We have names but no clear identities. Were these separate tribes united under one banner, or loose allies of convenience? And why did they risk everything to attack the mightiest civilizations of their time? The Medinet Habu carvings give us more questions than answers, but they also offer a crucial insight. The Sea Peoples weren't mindless destroyers. Their intricate armor, their well-built ships, even the way they transported their families suggests sophistication and purpose. Maybe they weren't the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but its victims, pushed to desperate acts by a world unraveling around them. Or perhaps they were the spark that lit the powder keg of an already fragile system. Either way, their story reminds us that history's greatest mysteries often lie not in what was written, but in what was left unsaid. If you gathered 10 historians in a room and asked where the Sea Peoples came from, you'd likely get 12 different answers. The mystery of their origins has spawned theories as varied as the cultures they supposedly destroyed. Some point to the ruins of Mycenaean palaces, burned around the same time the Sea Peoples emerged, and suggest these warriors were displaced Greeks, noble turned desperate after their own civilization crumbled. Others look to the central Mediterranean, where artifacts resembling the Sea Peoples' distinctive horned helmets have been found on Sardinia. Could these invaders have been the Trojans, a group later mentioned as Egyptian mercenaries? The connections are tantalizing but frustratingly thin. Then there's the Peliset, whose name echoes through Egyptian records and who might have eventually settled in Canaan as the Philistines of biblical fame. Their pottery bears striking similarities to styles from the Aegean, hinting at a possible Greek or Anatolian origin. But here's the catch: no single theory fits all the evidence. The Trojans, the Peliset, the Lucca, and others named in ancient texts appear too culturally distinct to be one homogeneous group. This has led some scholars to propose an even more radical idea. The Sea Peoples weren't a single nation but a coalition of the displaced, a motley alliance of refugees, mercenaries, and opportunists banded together by the chaos of their collapsing world. Imagine a storm surge, not of water but of humanity. Droughts, earthquakes, and resource shortages could have sent waves of migration crashing across the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, even coastal cities in Anatolia, all might have contributed to this human tide. When survival is at stake, people become unpredictable. Farmers take up swords, sailors turn to piracy. Entire villages might have taken to the sea not as conquerors but as desperate survivors, only to be branded as barbarians by the empires they threatened. The irony is thick. The very civilizations that labeled the Sea Peoples as mindless destroyers might have created them. Overextension, climate shifts, and internal strife could have weakened these Bronze Age powers, making them vulnerable to any spark, whether natural disaster or human desperation. So were the Sea Peoples the cause of the collapse or just a symptom? The answer might be both. Like shadows cast by a dying fire, their story is one of movement, adaptation, and survival in a world that was already falling apart. The ruins of the Bronze Age tell a story of fire and chaos, but reading that story isn't as simple as connecting dots. Take the city of Ugarit, a thriving port in modern-day Syria, whose last desperate letter pleaded for help against invaders only to be left unanswered. When archaeologists uncovered its ashes, they found a city frozen in panic, houses abandoned mid-meal, weapons scattered in the streets, and no signs of rebuilding. This wasn't just conquest, it was erasure. Yet for all the destruction, there's no carved inscription here saying, "Destroyed by the Sea Peoples." The evidence is circumstantial, a puzzle where the pieces could fit multiple pictures. Pottery, oddly enough, becomes a crucial clue. In places like Ashkelon and Ekron, styles shifted abruptly from local designs to something entirely new, heavily decorated with spiral patterns, eerily similar to Aegean techniques. These weren't gradual changes born of trade, but sudden replacements, as if new people had arrived and brought their traditions with them. Could these be the Peliset settling in Canaan after their raids? Maybe, but pottery alone can't confirm an invasion. Styles spread for many reasons: refugees, artisans moving between cities, even fashion trends. The challenge is distinguishing between cultural exchange and conquest. Then there are the graves. Near the ruins of Hatusa, the Hittite capital, mass burials hold skeletons bearing brutal injuries, skulls split by swords, arrowheads lodged in bone. The timing matches the Sea People's supposed rampage, but violence was common in the ancient world. Were these victims of a single catastrophic attack, or casualties from years of instability? Even more confounding are the sites where natural disasters seem to share the blame. At Troy and Mycenae, collapsed walls and layers of ash suggest earthquakes might have weakened cities before invaders finished the job. Archaeology's greatest lesson here is humility. The past rarely leaves a single, clear fingerprint. Instead, it offers fragments: a charred grain storage jar hinting at famine, a shattered statue of a Hittite king symbolizing lost authority, a shipwreck laden with copper ingots revealing a trade network in freefall. The Sea Peoples didn't operate in a vacuum. They were part of a chain reaction where climate, politics, and chance collided. So when we sift through these ruins, we're not just hunting for invaders. We're piecing together the final days of a world that no longer knew how to save itself. The Hittites weren't just another kingdom. They were the iron fist of the Bronze Age, ruling from their fortified capital of Hatusa with an empire stretching across modern-day Turkey and Syria. Their chariots were the terror of the battlefield, their treaties carved into silver tablets, their gods worshipped from distant lands. Yet in the span of a generation, this colossal power disintegrated. The question isn't just how the Hittites fell, but why their collapse was so total that even their language was forgotten for millennia. The Sea Peoples loom large in this mystery, but the truth is far more layered. Among the rubble of Hatusa, archaeologists found something startling, not signs of a grand battle, but of a city quietly abandoned. Grain stores lay empty, temples stripped of valuables, and the palace archives meticulously packed up before being left to decay. This wasn't the work of a sudden invasion. It hints at a slow unraveling where drought and famine may have hollowed out the empire from within. A clay tablet from Ugarit, a Hittite ally, captures the desperation. Our food is gone, the ships of the enemy are at our shores. Where are your armies? The plea was never answered. By the time the Sea Peoples arrived, the Hittite military, once invincible, may have already been a shadow of its former self. Yet the Sea Peoples' role can't be dismissed. Inscriptions from Egypt describe them battling the Hittites, and the timing aligns with Hatusa's final days. But here's the twist. Some scholars argue the invaders didn't topple the empire, they scavenged it. Imagine a wounded giant, weakened by years of crop failures and revolts, finally succumbing to opportunistic strikes. The Sea Peoples might have been the final straw, but the Hittites' own vulnerabilities made the fall inevitable. What's haunting is how familiar this pattern feels. Empires rarely collapse from a single blow. More often, it's a cascade: bad harvest straining the economy, rebellions fracturing unity, and then, when the structure is brittle enough, an external shock shatters it entirely. The Hittites' fate warns us that even the mightiest civilizations are fragile when their foundations crack. And in their ruins, we find not just the story of the Sea Peoples, but a timeless lesson about the thin line between power and peril. The image of the Sea Peoples as bloodthirsty marauders smashing through civilizations has dominated popular imagination for centuries. But what if we've misunderstood them entirely? Look closer, and a different possibility emerges, one where these so-called invaders were themselves victims of a world in crisis. Across the Mediterranean, tree rings and sediment cores tell a story of prolonged droughts around 1200 before the Common Era. Crops failed, rivers dried up, and famine likely sent entire populations scrambling for survival. Could the Sea Peoples' infamous raids have been acts of desperation rather than conquest? Consider the accounts from Egypt's Medinet Habu temple once more. The carvings don't just show warriors, they depict families, ox carts piled with belongings, and entire communities on the move. This wasn't the behavior of nomadic pirates. It was the mass migration of a people with nowhere left to go. Ancient texts from Ugarit speak of enemy ships, yes, but also of cities begging for grain shipments as hunger gripped the land. The Sea Peoples may have been both the cause and the consequence of collapse, forced into violence by the same disasters that crippled the empires they attacked. Yet there's another side to the coin. Some groups among the Sea Peoples, like the Trojans, later appear as elite mercenaries in Egyptian service. Their skill in battle suggests military professionalism, not just frantic survival. Could the truth lie somewhere in between? Imagine a fractured network of warriors, refugees, and opportunists, some fleeing starvation, others selling their swords to the highest bidder, and a few perhaps seizing the chance to carve out new kingdoms from the chaos. The debate isn't just academic. It changes how we see history's turning points. If the Sea Peoples were primarily migrants, their story becomes a tragic echo of modern crises: climate refugees pushed into conflict by circumstances beyond their control. But if they were conquerors, they represent something darker: the fragility of order in the face of unchecked ambition. Archaeology offers no easy verdict. In the ruins of coastal cities, we find both hastily built refugee camps and meticulously planned fortifications. as if the sea peoples were simultaneously fleeing one disaster and creating another. Perhaps the most revealing clue lies in what happened after the dust settled. The Peliset, once branded as invaders, eventually settled in Canaan and became the Philistines, not as destroyers, but as farmers, traders, and even rivals to the Israelites. Their pottery and architecture blended local traditions with Aegean influences, suggesting a people adapting rather than erasing. This complicates the narrative of mindless devastation. After all, true conquerors rarely settled down to till the soil. So were the sea peoples villains or victims? The answer might be both. History is rarely kind enough to give us clear heroes and monsters. Instead, it offers messy realities where hunger and ambition collide, where the line between survival and aggression blurs, and where the collapse of one world becomes the birth pains of another. The sea peoples didn't just destroy civilizations, they embodied the chaos of an age where everyone, from peasant to pharaoh, was struggling to navigate a world coming apart at the seams. The grand palaces of Mycenae and Pylos stand today as broken silhouettes against the Greek sky, their massive walls bearing silent witness to one of history's most dramatic falls. At the height of their power, the Mycenaeans dominated the Aegean with their warrior culture, intricate trade networks, and the mysterious Linear B script, Europe's first written language. Then, around 1200 before the Common Era, their world came crashing down. The timing is impossible to ignore. The Mycenaean Collapse aligns almost perfectly with the first recorded appearances of the Sea Peoples. Could these shadowy invaders have played a role in Greece's Dark Age, or might they have been Mycenaeans themselves, driven to desperation by their own crumbling society? Linear B tablets found in the ruins of Pylos tell a haunting story of a civilization in distress. They speak of emergency grain rations, of watchmen stationed along the coast, of bronze being hastily collected for weapons. These weren't the records of a confident empire, but of a people bracing for catastrophe. Some tablets even mention "watchers for the sea," a phrase that sends chills down the spine when we consider the Sea People's naval raids. Yet there's no explicit mention of foreign invaders, only hints of internal rebellions, food shortages, and a ruling class struggling to maintain control. So were the Mycenaeans destroyed from within, or did outside forces push them over the edge? Archaeology paints a complex picture. At many Mycenaean sites, layers of ash suggest violent destruction, but whether by earthquake, revolt, or invasion remains unclear. The palace at Turin shows signs of siege, its massive cyclopean walls scarred by fire. Yet at other locations, the evidence points to gradual abandonment rather than sudden attack. This inconsistency has led some scholars to propose a startling theory. Perhaps groups of Mycenaeans, displaced by internal collapse, joined the Sea Peoples' Confederation. Their seafaring skills and knowledge of Aegean strongholds would have made them invaluable to any raiding force. There's a provocative symmetry to this idea. The very warriors who once defended Mycenaean palaces might have become the raiders who targeted them. Imagine a band of elite soldiers left jobless when their kings fell, turning their combat skills toward piracy. Or entire communities facing starvation after crop failures, taking to the sea in search of survival. The distinction between victim and aggressor blurs in such scenarios. A Mycenaean sailor fleeing a burning city might later be labeled a Sea People's warrior when seen through the eyes of an Egyptian scribe. The cultural echoes are equally compelling. Among the Sea Peoples listed at Medinet Habu are the Denyen, a name that recalls the Danaoi Homer's term for the Greeks at Troy. Could these have been Mycenaean remnants, carrying their epic traditions even as they became part of the chaos reshaping the Mediterranean? Later Greek legends speak of a return of the Heraclidai, a mythical invasion that some interpret as a garbled memory of this turbulent era. The threads are tantalizing but frayed, leaving us to wonder how much was lost when the Linear B tablets fell silent. What makes the Mycenaean connection so fascinating is how it challenges simplistic narratives of good versus evil. Civilizations don't just vanish at the hands of faceless marauders. They fracture, adapt, and sometimes transform into something unrecognizable. If Mycenaean warriors did join the Sea Peoples, they weren't mindless destroyers, they were survivors navigating a world where the old rules no longer applied. Their story reminds us that collapse is rarely a single event but a cascade of choices, disasters, and reinventions. And in the ashes of their palaces, we find not just an ending, but the messy beginnings of what would one day become classical Greece. Egypt stood as the last domino still standing after the Sea People's rampage, but Pharaoh Ramses III's victory came at a staggering price. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict a glorious Egyptian triumph, ships engulfed in flames, captured sea peoples bound in ropes, and the pharaoh towering over his enemies. Yet these carvings tell only half the story. Behind the propaganda, Egypt was bleeding. The battle drained the treasury, coastal cities lay in ruins, and the once lucrative trade routes with the collapsed Hittite Empire evaporated overnight. For all Ramses boasts, his kingdom emerged from the conflict hobbled, its economy crippled, and its influence diminished. This wasn't just a victory, it was survival by the narrowest of margins. What made Egypt different? Geography played a crucial role. Unlike the Hittites or Mycenaeans, Egypt had the Nile, a natural fortress with deserts to the east and west and cataracts to the south. Even if the Sea Peoples breached the delta, the heartland remained protected. But Egypt's real advantage might have been adaptability. Records show Ramses didn't just fight the Sea Peoples, he co-opted them. Some captured warriors were pressed into service as elite mercenaries. Their combat skills turned against future invaders. Others were settled in strategic border regions, acting as buffers against new threats. The pharaoh understood that sheer military might wasn't enough to survive. Egypt had to absorb the shock rather than resist it outright. The aftermath reveals a darker truth. Papyrus documents from the reign of Ramses III's successors describe labor strikes, tomb robberies, and even an attempted coup unthinkable in Egypt's heyday. The grain shortages grew so severe that workers at Deir el-Medina staged what might be history's first recorded strike, chanting, "We are hungry." This wasn't just post-war hardship. It was the unraveling of a system. The Sea Peoples hadn't conquered Egypt, but they'd exposed its vulnerabilities. Without the wealth flowing in from lost trading partners like Ugarit and Mycenae, the pharaohs could no longer maintain the lavish temples or feed the armies that had once made them invincible. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in what Egypt stopped doing. For centuries, pharaohs had launched grand construction projects to proclaim their divinity. After Ramses III, monumental architecture dwindled. The later rulers of the 20th dynasty recycled stone from older monuments, a stark symbol of faded glory. Even the art changed. Where once there were scenes of conquest, now there were prayers for protection. The message is clear: Egypt had shifted from expansion to survival mode. So what does this tell us about the Sea People's true power? They may not have been an unstoppable military force, but they were catalysts, the spark that ignited the tinder of an already faltering system. Egypt's near collapse proves even the mightiest empires are fragile when their economic and ecological foundations crack. The Sea Peoples didn't just attack cities, they severed the invisible threads of trade, trust, and tradition that held the Bronze Age world together. And in doing so, they forced history's greatest civilization to choose between adaptation and extinction. That, more than any battle, was their lasting legacy. The Philistines stand out in the biblical narrative as formidable foes, their names synonymous with conflict: Goliath towering over the Israelite army, Samson pulling down their temple, and their cities like Gaza and Ashkelon serving as enduring symbols of resistance. But beneath these legendary clashes lies a deeper mystery. Where did they come from? The answer might be buried in the ruins of their cities, where archaeologists have unearthed pottery that doesn't match local Canaanite styles. Instead, these artifacts, decorated with spirals, birds, and intricate geometric patterns, bear an uncanny resemblance to ceramics from the Aegean world. Could these be the fingerprints of the Paliset, the very same group Ramses III claimed to have defeated? Digging deeper into the soil of ancient Philistia reveals more than just pottery. At sites like Ekron and Ashdod, excavations uncovered hearths built in a distinct circular style, unknown in Canon but common in Mycenaean Greece. Even the way they cooked their food, using clay cooking jugs called bell-shaped craters, points to Aegean traditions. Then there's the architecture: massive pillared buildings resembling the Megaron halls of Mycenaean palaces. These weren't minor cultural borrowings, they were wholesale transplants of foreign ways of life. If the Philistines weren't the Paliset, the coincidence is staggering. But here's the twist: their DNA tells a more complicated story. Recent genetic studies of bones from Philistine graves show a mix of Southern European and local Levantine ancestry, suggesting they didn't arrive as conquerors alone, but as a people who intermarried and adapted over time. The biblical account adds another layer to the puzzle. Unlike the Canaanites, whom the texts describe as indigenous, the Philistines are consistently portrayed as outsiders, the uncircumcised, hailing from Kafta, a land many scholars link to Crete or Cyprus. This matches Egyptian records that place the Paliset among the northerners coming from all lands. Yet the Philistines weren't just raiders, they became settlers, establishing a pentapolis of 5 fortified cities that thrived for centuries. Their transition from feared invaders to entrenched neighbors raises a provocative question. Did the Sea People stop being invaders because they found a home? The most compelling clue might lie in their name itself. The Egyptian term Paliset and the Hebrew Plishtim are strikingly similar, but the Philistines never called themselves that. Inscriptions found in their cities use a language still undeciphered, leaving their own voice frustratingly silent. It's as if history labeled them before they could speak for themselves. This silence makes their story all the more poignant, a people remembered as villains, yet whose cultural legacy hints at a far richer identity. Their pottery styles eventually blended with local traditions, their gods fused with Canaanite deities, and by the time of the Babylonian conquests, they'd vanished as a distinct group. The Philistine enigma forces us to reconsider what it means to be a sea people. They weren't just destroyers, they were survivors, migrants, and ultimately neighbors. Their story bridges myth and archaeology, showing how the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse didn't just end civilizations, it reshaped them. Whether they were the Paliset or not, their journey from the Aegean to Canaan reflects a truth often lost in the ruins. History's so-called villains are usually just people caught in the tides of change, trying to carve out a place in a world that no longer had room for them. The weapons of the Sea Peoples gleam like ghostly reflections in the few surviving depictions. We have bronze helmets crested with feathers or horns, round shields slung across their backs, and swords unlike anything seen in the armies of Egypt or the Hittites. At Medinet Habu, the Egyptian carvings show them wielding long, straight blades, a stark contrast to the curved khopesh favored by Pharaoh's soldiers. But were these weapons truly revolutionary or just different? Some scholars argue the Sea Peoples' gear hints at advanced metallurgy, perhaps even early ironworking techniques trickling down from Anatolia. Others counter that their success came less from superior arms and more from sheer audacity, striking vulnerable targets with relentless speed before defenders could rally. The debate over their tactics is just as fierce. Unlike the chariot-heavy armies of the Bronze Age superpowers, the Sea Peoples seem to have fought primarily on foot, relying on mobility and coordinated strikes. Egyptian records describe their naval assaults as terrifyingly efficient, with ships landing warriors who attacked in disciplined formations. This suggests more than just ragtag pirates. It points to a force with training and cohesion. Yet there's a twist. Many of the cities they supposedly sacked show signs of being already weakened by famine or internal strife. The Hittite capital Hatusa, for example, was likely abandoned before invaders reached its gates. So did the Sea Peoples win because they were stronger, or because their enemies were already on their knees? One clue lies in the aftermath. After their raids, certain Sea Peoples groups, like the Trojans, appear in Egyptian service as elite bodyguards, their distinctive horned helmets now symbols of prestige. This wouldn't make sense if their weapons were obsolete. At the same time, artifacts from destroyed cities rarely show a technological gap. The swords and armor found in the ruins are functionally similar to those used by defenders. The real edge may have been psychological, the shock of facing an unknown enemy emerging from the sea, striking without warning and vanishing just as quickly. Consider the broader context. The Late Bronze Age was a time of standardization. Empires fielded similar chariots, similar swords, similar tactics. The Sea Peoples, by contrast, were unpredictable. Their mixed origins meant they could draw on diverse combat styles, from Aegean skirmishing techniques to Anatolian close-quarters fighting. Against overstretched empires relying on rigid systems, this flexibility might have been their greatest weapon. But here's the paradox: if their technology wasn't decisively better, why did they succeed where others failed? The answer might lie not in the weapons themselves, but in how they were used. While great kingdoms like Egypt and Hatusa were bogged down in bureaucracy, slow to muster troops, dependent on fragile supply lines, the Sea Peoples moved like water, flowing around obstacles and striking where resistance was weakest. Their victories weren't just about blades and shields. They were about exploiting a world where the old rules of warfare no longer applied. In the end, the Sea Peoples' greatest advantage may have been timing. They emerged at the precise moment when the Mediterranean's balance of power was fracturing, when a single bold strike could topple a teetering empire. Their weapons weren't magical, but in the right hands at the right time, they didn't need to be. The Mediterranean world of the Late Bronze Age was a delicate web of civilizations, each thread dependent on predictable rains and bountiful harvests. Then, around 1200 before the Common Era, the rains stopped. Tree rings from ancient Anatolian oaks tell a grim story: narrow, stunted growth lines indicating years of relentless drought. Sediment cores pulled from the seabed near Cyprus reveal layers of dust blown from parched farmlands, while pollen samples show sudden shifts from grain crops to drought-resistant weeds. These weren't isolated dry spells. They were climate shocks that stretched for decades, withering fields, emptying granaries, and setting the stage for catastrophe. Imagine a farming village in what's now southern Turkey. The wheat, already strained by years of poor harvests, fails completely. The local Hittite governor demands his usual tribute, but there's nothing left to give. Desperate families pack their ox carts and head toward the coast, joining streams of others fleeing inland famine. At the shoreline, they encounter fishermen turned raiders, their boats now tools of survival. This, some scholars argue, is how the Sea Peoples may have begun, not as a unified army, but as a wave of climate refugees pushed to extremes. The Egyptian term for them, foreign countries coming from the islands, takes on new meaning if those islands were starving. The archaeological record offers haunting support. At the Hittite capital of Hatusa, tablets beg for grain shipments to stave off hunger. In Greece, Linear B documents from Pylos detail emergency rations and coastal watchposts. Even wealthy Egypt saw Nile floods dwindle, its lifeblood faltering. When societies this interconnected face simultaneous collapse, the dominoes fall fast. A single bad harvest could be weathered, but decades of drought that breaks systems, topples rulers, and sends populations reeling in search of survival. The Sea People's infamous raids might not have been conquest so much as desperate grabs for food and land by people with no other options. Yet the climate hypothesis isn't without its critics. Some point out that droughts had struck the region before without causing collapse. Others argue that the Sea People's coordinated attacks suggest more organization than typical refugee movements. But here's the nuance: climate rarely acts alone. Prolonged droughts weaken governments, spark rebellions, and disrupt trade networks, creating openings for opportunistic raids. A starving farmer might take up arms if a passing warlord promises food. A displaced sailor could turn pirate when legitimate trade dries up. The Sea Peoples may have been both victims and exploiters of a climate crisis, their violence fueled by deeper systemic failures. The most compelling evidence comes from beneath the waves. Shipwrecks like the one at Uluburan, laden with copper ingots and luxury goods, show how vital maritime trade was to the Bronze Age world. When droughts hit, the flow of tin for bronze weapons or cedar for ships faltered, leaving kingdoms vulnerable. Raiders targeting these supply lines wouldn't just be stealing wealth, they'd be severing the lifelines of empires. In this light, the Sea Peoples emerge less as mindless destroyers and more as actors in a perfect storm, where environmental collapse met human desperation. What makes this theory so resonant today is its uncomfortable familiarity. Modern climate migration, resource conflicts, and failing states mirror the stresses of the late Bronze Age. The lesson isn't that climate change inevitably causes collapse, but that it exposes and amplifies existing weaknesses. The Sea Peoples didn't topple civilizations single-handedly. They were the spark that ignited tinder piled by years of ecological strain. Their story reminds us that history's greatest upheavals often begin not with a sword, but with a withering stalk of grain. The Bronze Age world hummed with the sound of commerce ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean, laden with copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Afghanistan, and luxury goods like ivory and ebony. These weren't just trade routes, they were the lifeblood of empires. Tin, especially, was the invisible backbone of civilization. Mixed with copper, it made bronze, the metal that forged weapons, tools, and the very structures of society. But what happens when that supply chain snaps? Imagine a blacksmith in Mycenae staring at an empty workshop, a Hittite general unable to arm his troops, or an Egyptian artisan with no bronze to craft temple offerings. This wasn't just an economic hiccup, it was a systemic failure that reached into every corner of daily life. The collapse of these trade networks didn't happen overnight. Droughts and unrest likely disrupted overland routes first, making tin shipments erratic. Then came the shipwrecks, like the Uluburan, a vessel laden with 10 tons of copper ingots that sank off the Turkish coast. Its cargo, enough to outfit an army, now lies at the bottom of the sea. With each lost shipment, the Bronze Age world grew more desperate. Kings hoarded dwindling supplies, prices skyrocketed, and artisans turned to recycling old bronze, melting down heirlooms just to keep working. The sheer scale of this breakdown is staggering. At the peak of the crisis, some regions reverted to using stone tools, a technological backstep unseen for centuries. Into this chaos sailed the Sea Peoples, but here's the twist. Were they the cause of the collapse or its product? Some scholars argue their raids targeted already faltering trade hubs, like Ugarit, a wealthy port whose last surviving letter pleaded for help against invaders while also begging for grain. The city's destruction wasn't just a military loss, it was the severing of a critical trade node. Yet other evidence suggests the Sea Peoples might have initially been traders themselves, merchants turned raiders when the system they relied on disintegrated. A single clay tablet from Cyprus mentions pirates attacking ships, but the word used could also mean sea traders. The line between commerce and plunder, it seems, was perilously thin in those desperate times. The economic domino effect reveals a chilling pattern. As trade collapsed, so did the specialized labor it supported. Artisans, sailors, and scribes found themselves without work, creating pools of disaffected people ripe for recruitment or rebellion. The Sea Peoples' ranks may have swelled with these displaced workers, their skills repurposed for war. A metalsmith who once crafted temple ornaments could just as easily forge swords. A sailor accustomed to hauling tin might now pilot a raiding vessel. Even the famed ox cart migrations depicted at Medinet Habu take on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Were these families fleeing famine or itinerant traders whose livelihood had vanished? Perhaps the most haunting clue lies in what came after. In the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, the Iron Age emerged, not because iron was superior at first, but because the old bronze supply chains were beyond repair. Societies adapted out of necessity, turning to locally available resources. The Sea Peoples, whether catalysts or casualties of this transition, embodied the brutal truth that no civilization, no matter how grand, is immune to the whims of economics. Their story isn't just about swords and ships, it's about what happens when the invisible threads holding the world together fray beyond repair. And in that, they hold up a mirror to our own interconnected age where the next collapse might not come from the edge of a blade, but from the collapse of systems we've come to take for granted. The ruins left by the Sea Peoples weren't just graves of old empires, they were incubators for something new. Amidst the ashes of burned cities and shattered palaces, strange innovations began to appear. In Canaan, where the Philistines settled, pottery styles abruptly shifted from local designs to vibrant Aegean-inspired patterns. Along the Levantine coast, artisans started crafting iron tools with techniques possibly borrowed from Anatolian migrants. Even Egypt, though it resisted conquest, saw its art take on bolder, more dynamic forms in the aftermath of the raids. The irony is striking. A group remembered for destruction might have accidentally sparked cultural rebirth. Take the Philistines' culinary revolution. Excavations at Ashkelon reveal something unexpected: grinding stones for a type of flour unknown in Canaan, alongside clay cooking jugs identical to those found in Mycenaean Greece. This wasn't just new food, it was an entire cuisine transplanted across the sea. Similarly, their temples blended Canaanite layouts with Aegean-style pillars, creating hybrid sacred spaces. Even their famed beer, brewed with exotic additives like figs and juniper, became a regional delicacy. These weren't the acts of mindless destroyers, but of a people adapting old traditions to new lands and reshaping local culture in the process. Then there's the technological leap. The Sea Peoples' era coincides with bronze giving way to iron, not as a choice, but a necessity. With trade networks in ruins and tin supplies cut off, blacksmiths experimented with iron ore, a metal once considered inferior due to its brittleness. Through trial and error, they developed carburization techniques to strengthen it. Some scholars speculate that displaced Anatolian metalworkers, possibly among the Sea Peoples' ranks, accelerated this shift. The result: iron tools that were cheaper and more widely available than bronze, democratizing technology in ways that would redefine farming, warfare, and craftsmanship. But the most profound changes might have been political. The centralized palace economies of the Bronze Age, where kings controlled everything from grain stores to craft workshops, collapsed under the weight of invasions and droughts. In their place emerged smaller, more flexible city-states. The Philistine Pentapolis operated not as a monolithic empire, but as a loose alliance of equals. Phoenician ports like Tyre and Sidon thrived by prioritizing trade over conquest. Even Egypt decentralized, with regional governors gaining unprecedented autonomy. This wasn't just recovery, it was reinvention. The old top-down systems had failed, and the survivors, knowingly or not, built something more resilient in their place. The Sea People's greatest legacy might be what they didn't destroy. By toppling rigid hierarchies, they created space for experimentation. By mixing displaced populations, they forced cultural cross-pollination. And by severing old dependencies, they made room for new ideas. The Iron Age didn't rise despite the chaos, it rose because of it. So were the Sea People's barbarians at the gates or unwitting midwives of a new world. History rarely fits neat labels. What's certain is that the world after them looked very different from the one they shattered, and in that difference lies their paradoxical imprint on history. The silence of the Sea Peoples is one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. Unlike the Egyptians with their hieroglyphs or the Hittites with their cuneiform tablets, these enigmatic invaders left behind no dictionaries, no royal decrees, not even a single scratched inscription to call their own. All we have are the names others gave them: Peliset, Sheridan, Lucca, scattered like breadcrumbs in the records of their enemies. These fragments hint at something extraordinary, the possibility that the Sea Peoples spoke languages lost to time, dialects that might hold the key to unraveling where they came from and who they truly were. Linguists examining these names have noticed something curious. Words like Peliset and Sheridan don't sound Egyptian or Semitic. Instead, they echo the cadence of Indo-European tongues, the language family that includes Hittite, Greek, and later Latin. Take the name Denyon, which some scholars link to the Danaoi, Homer's term for the Greeks. Could this mean at least some Sea Peoples hailed from the Aegean world? The resemblance is striking, but without full sentences or grammar to analyze. It's like trying to reconstruct an entire symphony from a few stray notes. The challenge doesn't end there. Even if we assume some Sea Peoples spoke an Indo-European language, which branch did it belong to? The Lucca, for instance, are often tied to Lycia in southwest Anatolia, where a distinct Indo-European language was spoken. But the Sheridan's name recalls Sardinia, while the Shekelesh might connect to Sicily, regions where entirely different linguistic traditions thrived. This patchwork of clues suggests the Sea Peoples weren't a monolithic culture but a mosaic of groups, each with their own dialects and origins. Imagine the clamor of their camps, a cacophony of languages shouted across fires, orders translated hastily before battle, alliances negotiated through broken phrases and gestures. This linguistic chaos might explain why no single writing system emerged among them. Unlike settled civilizations that developed scripts for bureaucracy or religion, the Sea Peoples were constantly on the move, their survival depending more on swords than scribes. Yet their linguistic legacy might not be entirely lost. Some researchers propose that traces of the Sea Peoples' speech survive in place names. The Philistine city of Ashkelon, for example, has a name that doesn't fit Semitic patterns, possibly borrowed from an earlier Aegean term. Even the word Philistine itself, though filtered through Hebrew and Greek, might preserve a distant echo of what the Peliset called themselves. These are whispers at best, but in the absence of written records, they are all we have. What makes this silence so frustrating is what it could reveal. Language isn't just about words, it's a window into how people saw the world. Had we even a single Sea People's poem or treaty, we might know if they worshipped the same gods as the Mycenaeans or shared the Hittites' legal codes. We might understand whether their raids were acts of desperation or calculated conquest. Instead, we're left with a void, one that reminds us how much of history is written not just by the victors, but by those who left paper or clayed trails behind. The irony is profound. These warriors who toppled empires and redrawn maps vanished not just from the physical world, but from the very medium we use to remember it. Their voices are the ultimate ghost story, lingering just beyond the edge of comprehension. And yet, in that silence, they speak volumes about the fragility of memory, the bias of history, and the countless stories that slip through the cracks of time. The Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu offer us a rare window into the Sea People's naval tactics, frozen in stone like an ancient battle manual. Their ships cut through the waves with a sleek, predatory design sharper and lighter than the bulky Egyptian vessels, built for speed rather than brute force. Unlike the towering, ornate warships of Pharaoh's fleet, the invaders' boats sat low in the water, their prows tipped with vicious bird-like beaks designed for ramming. But what's truly striking are the details. Rows of shields lining the sides, not just for defense but as platforms for warriors to leap onto enemy decks. These weren't floating fortresses, they were agile weapons, extensions of the fighters themselves. The reliefs depict chaos in motion, Sea People's vessels crashing into Egyptian ships, their crews swarming over the sides with swords drawn. One scene shows a grappling hook arcing through the air, a simple yet devastating tool for binding enemy ships together, turning naval combat into a bloody melee. This was warfare stripped to its essentials. No grand formations, no protracted sieges, just rapid, overwhelming force. The Egyptians, accustomed to orderly chariot charges and disciplined infantry lines, seemed caught off guard by the ferocity of these close-quarters brawls at sea. But the Sea People's real innovation might have been their coordination. The carvings show multiple ships attacking in unison, suggesting they'd mastered the art of synchronized strikes. Imagine the terror of watching a dozen of these swift raiders emerge from the horizon, closing the distance before defenders could rally. Their tactics exploited the element of surprise, targeting coastal cities and trade routes where resistance was weakest. A clay tablet from Ugarit captures the panic. Enemy ships are already here, they have set fire to my towns. The speed of these attacks hints at meticulous planning raiders who'd studied currents, winds, and the rhythms of their targets. Yet for all their prowess, the Sea People's naval dominance wasn't just about skill. Their success relied on a Mediterranean world unprepared for this kind of warfare. Bronze Age kingdoms had focused on land armies. Their navies were afterthoughts meant for transport rather than battle. When faced with dedicated maritime raiders, these empires had no playbook. The Sea Peoples didn't just fight differently, they rewrote the rules, proving that in an age of crumbling certainties, adaptability was the deadliest weapon of all. The Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu don't describe a single, unified enemy. They list a bewildering array of names, Sheridan with their horned helmets, Lucca from the Lycian coast, Jekka, who later settled in Dor, and half a dozen others. This raises a fundamental question. Were the Sea Peoples a cohesive nation, or a fleeting alliance of disparate tribes thrown together by circumstance? The distinction matters because it changes how we understand their impact. A unified empire could plan long-term conquests, but a temporary coalition would have been driven by more immediate needs: survival, plunder, or sheer desperation. Clues from the ancient texts suggest these groups operated with startling coordination. The records describe simultaneous attacks by land and sea, strikes timed to exploit weak points across vast distances. This level of synchronization hints at some form of shared strategy, whether through formal alliances or loose agreements among warlords. Imagine a war council on some forgotten shore, where Sardinian chieftains debated tactics with Peliset captains under the flickering light of torches. What bound them together? The likeliest answer is mutual interest, the Bronze Age equivalent of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." With empires like the Hittites and Mycenaeans crumbling, opportunistic leaders might have seen a chance to carve out new territories or simply loot what remained of the old world. Yet the coalition's diversity also explains why it didn't last. The Sardinian, for instance, appear in Egyptian records first as invaders, then later as elite mercenaries in Pharaoh's army. The Lucca, meanwhile, fade from history after their raids, possibly returning to their Anatolian homelands. This fluidity suggests the Sea Peoples weren't bound by deep cultural ties, but by short-term goals. Once the richest targets were exhausted or resistance grew too strong, the alliance likely fractured. Some groups settled where they could, the Peliset in Canaan, the Jekka along the Levantine coast, while others vanished into obscurity. The most compelling evidence for this patchwork identity lies in their material culture. Excavated weapons and armor, very dramatically feathered helmets alongside Aegean-style greaves, swords of Anatolian design mixed with shields resembling those from Sardinia. This isn't the uniform equipment of a standing army, but the eclectic toolkit of warriors who brought their homeland's traditions with them. Even their famed naval tactics support the idea. Some ships show ramming prows ideal for quick strikes, while others appear built for transporting families and livestock, hinting at different priorities among the groups. What's fascinating is how this mirrors other historical confederations, from the Viking Great Heathen Army to the Mongol hordes. Like those later coalitions, the Sea Peoples may have been a volatile mix of ambition and necessity, strong enough to topple kingdoms when united, but too disparate to build anything lasting. Their legacy, then, isn't just in the empires they destroyed, but in the accidental reshuffling of the ancient world. By the time their alliance dissolved, the Mediterranean's political map had been redrawn, leaving behind not a single victor, but a scattering of survivors picking up the pieces. The image of the Sea Peoples as a faceless tide of destruction has been etched into popular imagination, fueled by dramatic Egyptian carvings and apocalyptic theories about the Bronze Age collapse. But peel back the layers of myth, and a more nuanced reality emerges. Ancient propaganda played no small part in shaping their fearsome reputation. Pharaoh Ramses III's temple reliefs weren't just records of battle. They were carefully crafted political theater, designed to glorify his victories and justify the immense cost of war. The inscriptions boast of enemies cut down like grass, their ships turned to ashes. Yet for all the vivid brutality, these accounts are suspiciously silent on Egypt's own staggering losses, from drained treasuries to ravaged farmlands. The truth, the Sea Peoples may have been as much a convenient scapegoat as a genuine existential threat. Archaeology complicates the narrative further. While some cities like Ugarit show clear signs of violent destruction, others reveal a slower decline, abandoned granaries, repurposed temples, and layers of sediment suggesting prolonged drought. The infamous ox cart migrations depicted at Medinet Habu hint at a reality often glossed over in the legends. Many Sea Peoples weren't just warriors but entire communities, women and children included, fleeing ecological disaster or political upheaval. A handful of excavated settlements even show peaceful integration, where newcomers adopted local customs while introducing their own. At Philistine Ashkelon, for instance, Aegean-style pottery gradually blended with Canaanite designs, suggesting coexistence rather than constant conflict. The exaggeration of their barbarism also reflects an age-old tendency to vilify outsiders. To the Egyptians, the sea peoples were the ultimate other, foreign in dress, speech, and gods. Their horned helmets and unfamiliar weapons made them perfect villains for royal propaganda. Yet the same carvings that depict them as savages also reveal their sophistication. Intricately designed ships, standardized armor, and coordinated tactics that imply military professionalism. Even their name is a misnomer. They weren't a single people, but a mosaic of groups with diverse origins, some of whom, like the Sardinian, later served as elite troops in the very armies that once fought them. Perhaps the most telling evidence against their demonization lies in what followed the chaos. The Iron Age societies that rose from the ashes weren't Dark Age barbarians but vibrant hybrids, where technologies like iron smelting and alphabetic writing flourished. The Philistines, once reviled in biblical texts, became key players in regional trade, their cities thriving for centuries. If the sea peoples were truly mindless destroyers, why did the world they left behind innovate rather than regress? The answer may be simple. History remembers them through the lens of those who survived to write it. Their legacy isn't one of mindless devastation, but of a complex interplay between collapse and renewal, where the line between villain and victim blurs with every new discovery. The story of the sea peoples isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting our own turbulent times. 3,000 years ago, the Mediterranean faced a perfect storm of drought, mass migration, and collapsing trade networks, challenges that feel uncomfortably familiar today. Just as crop failures and rising seas forced entire communities to abandon their homelands then, modern climate change is displacing millions, reshaping coastlines, and straining resources. The parallels are impossible to ignore, but beyond the surface-level comparisons, the Bronze Age collapse offers something far more valuable, a case study in how societies respond when pushed to the brink. Take the climate connection first. Tree ring studies show the late Bronze Age suffered prolonged megadroughts, turning fertile regions into dust bowls. Sound familiar? Modern Syria's civil war was preceded by the worst drought in recorded history, driving rural populations into overcrowded cities and fueling unrest. Like the sea peoples who may have migrated out of necessity rather than conquest, today's climate refugees often have no choice but to move, whether from sinking Pacific islands or the drying Sahel. The lesson here isn't that migration causes collapse, but that ignoring environmental strain makes societies vulnerable to chain reactions. When the Hittite Empire begged Egypt for grain shipments as famine loomed, it revealed an interdependence we now recognize in our globalized food systems. One failed harvest, one disrupted supply chain, and the dominoes start to fall. Then there's the question of resilience. The civilizations that vanished during the Bronze Age collapse. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, were highly centralized with rigid hierarchies and brittle supply lines. When drought hit or invaders came, their top-heavy systems had no flexibility to adapt. Contrast that with Egypt, which survived by absorbing rather than resisting change and listing defeated sea peoples as mercenaries, decentralizing power and shifting economic priorities. Today's equivalent might be the difference between nations clinging to outdated energy models and those investing in renewable infrastructure. Adaptation isn't about strength alone, it's about the capacity to transform when old ways fail. But perhaps the most striking parallel lies in how we label those caught in the chaos. The sea peoples were branded as mindless destroyers by the empires they threatened, just as modern migrants are often scapegoated for economic woes. Archaeology tells a different story, one of skilled metalworkers, innovative shipbuilders, and displaced families simply trying to survive. The Philistines, once vilified in biblical texts, became productive settlers who enriched Canaanite culture with new technologies and art styles. Their trajectory reminds us that today's crises might be tomorrow's catalysts for renewal. After all, the Iron Age innovations that followed the Bronze Age collapse democratized metalworking, decentralized governance, cultural hybridization, laid foundations for classical antiquity's golden age. The real warning from the Sea People's era isn't that collapse happens, but how we choose to respond. Societies that doubled down on old hierarchies crumbled, while those that adapted sometimes painfully found paths forward. As rising temperatures and political tensions test our own world's stability, their story challenges us to ask, are we building walls against change or bridges to new possibilities? The difference might determine whether future historians remember our age as another dark interlude or the birth of something resilient and new. Out of the smoke and rubble left by the Sea People's rampage, an extraordinary transformation began. The old order had shattered, Hittite palaces lay abandoned, Mycenaean trade routes fell silent, and Egypt retreated behind its borders. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does history. Along the Levantine coast, a new power emerged from the shadows, the Phoenicians. Unlike the centralized empires of the past, these seafaring traders built their strength not on conquest but on commerce. Their cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, became hubs of innovation, where artisans perfected glassblowing and dyed fabrics with vivid purple hues extracted from sea snails. Most revolutionary of all, they streamlined writing into a 22-letter alphabet, ditching the cumbersome cuneiform and hieroglyphs of their predecessors. This wasn't just a new script, it was a democratization of knowledge, a tool that would spread across the Mediterranean and lay the groundwork for Greek and Latin writing systems. Inland, another society was forging its identity amid the chaos, the early Israelites. Where the Phoenicians looked to the sea, the Israelites turned to the hills, building fortified villages like Jerusalem and Hebron. Their rise is shrouded in biblical narrative and archaeological debate, but one thing is clear: they represented a radical departure from Bronze Age norms. Unlike the god-kings of Egypt or the imperial bureaucracy of the Hittites, Israelite society organized around tribal alliances and a covenant with a single deity. The ruins of their settlements show no grand palaces or lavish tombs, but communal grain silos and simple pottery, evidence of an egalitarian ethos born in the crucible of collapse. Their most enduring innovation wasn't material but ideological: monotheism, a concept that would reshape spiritual thought across continents and millennia. The real surprise of this era wasn't just who rose, but how they rose. The Phoenicians and Israelites thrived by rejecting the old playbook of empire. Instead of relying on bronze monopolies or tribute systems, they embraced flexibility. Phoenician merchants adapted to any market, trading Egyptian papyrus for Spanish silver, Cypriot copper for Aegean olive oil. The Israelites, meanwhile, leveraged their decentralized structure to withstand pressures that toppled mightier kingdoms. When drought struck or raiders came, their scattered villages could regroup, unlike the Hittites' vulnerable capital. This resilience hints at a profound truth: the societies that survived the Bronze Age collapse weren't the strongest, but the most adaptable. Technological leaps followed this political reinvention. With bronze supplies disrupted, blacksmiths experimented with iron, refining furnaces to reach higher temperatures. The result: tools and weapons that were cheaper and more widely available than ever before. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians' shipbuilding techniques, learned perhaps from observing Sea People's vessels, allowed them to sail beyond the Mediterranean's horizon, reaching as far as Britain and West Africa. Even culinary habits shifted. At Philistine sites, archaeologists unearthed the first evidence of fermented fish sauce. a precursor to Roman garum suggesting food preservation techniques born from necessity became enduring traditions. The aftermath of the Sea People's raids wasn't a dark age so much as a reset. The old powers had clung to rigid systems until they crumbled. The new ones embraced fluidity. Where the Mycenaeans centralized grain storage in palatial warehouses, Israelite communities built shared silos. Where the Hittites hoarded tin to control bronze production, Phoenicians diversified trade goods. This was more than recovery, it was reinvention, proving that sometimes the most fertile ground for progress lies not in stability, but in the broken pieces of what came before. The legacy of this era isn't just in the kingdoms that rose, but in the enduring lesson they left. Civilization doesn't end when empires fall, it evolves. The mystery of the Sea Peoples has always been fertile ground for wild speculation, with theories stretching from the plausible to the downright fantastical. One of the most enduring and controversial ideas ties them to the lost civilization of Atlantis. The connection was first proposed in the 19th century, when scholars noticed Plato's description of Atlantis's sudden collapse mirrored the chaos of the Bronze Age. The logic seems tantalizing, a seafaring power vanishing without a trace, leaving only destruction in its wake. But here's the catch: Plato wrote about Atlantis nearly 1,000 years after the Sea People's raids, and his account was likely allegorical, not historical. No archaeological evidence links the two, yet the myth persists, a testament to how deeply we crave grand explanations for history's greatest puzzles. Then there's the theory that the Sea Peoples weren't invaders at all, but a secret maritime empire operating in the shadows. Proponents point to their coordinated attacks and advanced shipbuilding as proof of a sophisticated network, possibly controlling key trade routes before their downfall. Some even suggest they were the original Sea People, referenced in later Greek legends, a hidden force manipulating Mediterranean politics. The problem: no centralized infrastructure, no royal inscriptions, no evidence of a capital city has ever been found. Their fleeting appearances in records suggest they were more like a storm than a state, violent, unpredictable, and impossible to pin down. More grounded but still debated is the idea that the Sea Peoples included refugees from the volcanic eruption of Thera, the cataclysm that devastated the Minoan civilization centuries earlier. Could displaced survivors have kept their seafaring traditions alive, passing them down until their descendants emerged as raiders? It's an intriguing thought, but the timelines don't quite align. Thera erupted around 1600 before the Common Era, while the Sea Peoples appear 400 years later. That's a long gap for a culture to persist without leaving clearer traces. Perhaps the most compelling fringe theory links the Sea Peoples to the mysterious Luwians of Western Anatolia. Some scholars argue that inscriptions in the Luwian language hint at a vast but forgotten kingdom that collapsed inward, sending waves of migrants and mercenaries into the Mediterranean. There's circumstantial evidence, names like Lucca matching known Luwian regions, but without definitive proof. It remains a hypothesis. What's fascinating is how these theories, even the outlandish ones, reveal our obsession with filling history's gaps. The Sea People's silence invites speculation, and in that void, imagination rushes in. The line between fantasy and scholarship often blurs when dealing with the unknown. For every Atlantis enthusiast, there's a serious archaeologist sifting through pottery shards for clues. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, not a single grand narrative, but a messy convergence of disaster, migration, and opportunism. The Sea Peoples may never surrender all their secrets, but that's what keeps their story alive. After all, history's greatest mysteries aren't just about facts, they're about the stories we tell to make sense of the past. Science is peeling back layers of time, and the secrets of the sea peoples may finally be within reach. Recent breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis are revolutionizing our understanding of these elusive raiders, offering clues that pottery shards and temple carvings never could. At a burial site in Ashkelon, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: the bones of infants buried in Philistine-style pottery, their genetic material remarkably preserved. When researchers sequenced their DNA, they found a startling mix, strands tracing back to southern Europe alongside Levantine ancestry. This wasn't just cultural influence, it was proof of migration, a tangible link between the Philistines and the Aegean world. Suddenly, the Egyptian term Peliset takes on new weight, suggesting these weren't just mercenaries but entire communities transplanting their lives. But genetics alone can't tell the whole story. Cutting-edge isotopic analysis adds another layer, revealing where these people lived and what they ate. Tooth enamel from skeletons in coastal Cannon shows diets rich in seafood early in life, shifting to grains later, a pattern consistent with settlers adapting to new farmland. Meanwhile, lead isotopes in bronze artifacts trace the origins of metal ores, exposing trade networks that may have connected the sea peoples to Sardinia, Sicily, and beyond. These techniques paint a picture not of mindless pillagers, but of skilled navigators who knew the Mediterranean's hidden routes. The most tantalizing possibilities lie ahead. Projects like the Sea Peoples Genome Initiative aim to sequence DNA from dozens of Bronze Age sites, comparing samples from Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. Preliminary results hint at a genetic fingerprint shared among scattered coastal populations, a potential smoking gun for their origins, yet challenges remain. Ancient DNA degrades in warm climates, and many key sites, like the ruined ports of the Lucca lands, lie underwater or have been built over. What's clear is that science is dismantling old assumptions. The Sea Peoples weren't a monolithic horde, but a mosaic of groups with diverse roots, united by circumstance. As laboratories replace guesswork with data, we're closer than ever to answering the question that's haunted historians for millennia: not just who they were, but why they set the ancient world ablaze. The irony is rich. Their greatest secret may hide not in carved stone, but in the very bones they left behind. The Hittite Empire was a colossus of the Bronze Age, its iron-fisted rulers commanding an army that struck fear across Anatolia and the Levant. Yet when the Sea Peoples surged ashore, this mighty kingdom crumbled with shocking speed. How could an empire that once humbled Egypt and Babylon fall so easily? The answer lies not in the invaders' strength alone, but in the fatal cracks spreading through the Hittite realm long before the first foreign ship appeared on the horizon. At its peak, the Hittite military machine was unparalleled: chariots armored with bronze, infantry wielding sickle-shaped swords, and a network of fortresses guarding vital trade routes. But by the late 13th century, before the Common Era, this formidable system was rotting from within. Clay tablets from the capital Hatusa reveal a kingdom stretched too thin, its armies scattered across distant rebellions in Syria, while royal succession crises tore the court apart. One desperate letter from the last known Hittite king pleads for Egyptian grain shipments, exposing a crippling vulnerability. The empire had become dangerously dependent on imports to feed its people. When drought withered Anatolia's fields and trade routes faltered, the Hittites weren't just politically weak, they were starving. Geography compounded these woes. Unlike Egypt's natural Nile fortress, the Hittite heartland sprawled across open plateaus, its frontiers impossible to seal. The empire's very strength, control of lucrative metal trade routes, became its Achilles heel as copper and tin shipments dwindled. Archaeologists find telling clues in Hatusa's ruins. bronze statues melted down for weapons, palace archives carefully packed away as if for evacuation, but no evidence of the massive battle one would expect from an imperial capital's fall. The stark truth emerges: the Hittites may have abandoned their own throne city before invaders arrived, their collapse as much a surrender as a defeat. The Sea Peoples didn't conquer a healthy empire, they scavenged a carcass. Their raids targeted coastal cities already reeling from food shortages, severing the Hittites' last lifelines to Syrian wheat fields and Cypriot copper. Without these resources, the empire's professional army, dependent on bronze for weapons and grain for rations, simply dissolved. Some tablets hint at mass desertions, with soldiers fleeing to banditry rather than face starvation. Others describe local governors refusing orders, hoarding supplies for their own regions. This wasn't just military failure, it was the total breakdown of a social contract. What's haunting is how preventable this might have been. The Hittites knew of the Sea People's threat years in advance. Ugarit's frantic warnings about ships approaching were sent to Hatusa. Yet the empire, paralyzed by internal strife and resource shortages, couldn't mount an effective response. Its legendary chariots, devastating on open plains, were useless against naval raiders striking coastal settlements. The very rigidity that once made the Hittites formidable left them incapable of adapting when the rules of warfare changed overnight. The lesson written in Hatusa's ashes isn't about superior weapons or fearless invaders. It's about how empires fall when they mistake temporary strength for permanent invincibility. The Hittites didn't lose to the Sea Peoples because they were weak, they lost because they failed to see their own fragility until it was too late. And in that blindness, they became a warning for every civilization that would follow. Legends have a way of preserving truths in disguise, and the turbulent era of the Sea Peoples may have left its mark not just in ruins but in the myths that followed. Homer's Iliad, written centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, pulses with echoes of a world reshaped by seafaring warriors, Achilles leading his Myrmidons, Odysseus navigating treacherous waters, and the towering walls of Troy itself, a city that archaeology confirms was violently destroyed around the same time the Sea Peoples prowled the Mediterranean. Could these epic tales be garbled memories of real events, passed down through generations like a game of telephone across the ages? The connections are tantalizing. Among the Sea Peoples listed in Egyptian records are the Denyen, a name that uncannily resembles the Danaioi, Homer's term for the Greeks. The Lucca, another group mentioned at Medinet Habu, may link to Lycia, home of the legendary Trojan ally Sarpedon. Even the Philistines, descendants of the Peliset, appear in the Bible as foes of the Israelites. Goliath, with his towering stature and bronze armor, could be a folkloric remnant of these feared warriors. It's as if history and myth are two sides of the same coin, one stamped by scribes, the other shaped by poets, but the parallels run deeper than names. The Trojan War's backdrop, a coalition of Greek kingdoms sailing east to besiege a wealthy city, mirrors the Sea People's modus operandi, coordinated naval attacks on prosperous coastal settlements. Both narratives feature displaced heroes, shattered alliances, and a world plunged into chaos. Even the weapons align. Homer's heroes wield long, straight swords reminiscent of those carved at Medinet Habu, while their boar-tusk helmets recall Aegean designs favored by Mycenaean warriors who may have joined the Sea People's ranks. The most provocative theory suggests that the Trojan War wasn't just a conflict between Greeks and Trojans, but a fragment of the broader Bronze Age collapse, a single battle in a vast, forgotten struggle. Archaeologists note that Troy's destruction layer, dated to around 1180 before the Common Era, shows signs of both earthquake damage and human violence, a combination seen at other Sea People's targets. Perhaps the face that launched 1,000 ships was never just Helen's but the desperation of an entire civilization unraveling. Yet myths are more than coded history. They're cultural coping mechanisms, ways to make sense of catastrophe. The Greeks may have transformed the trauma of the Sea People's raids into a tale of heroic struggle, turning chaotic migrations into the orderly ranks of Agamemnon's army. The Philistines, vilified in Hebrew texts, became archetypal villains, their real complexity flattened into symbolism. Even the Egyptian habit of depicting the Sea Peoples as monstrous others fits this pattern. Legends simplifying the messy truth of collapse into clean narratives of good versus evil. What makes these echoes so compelling is their durability. Long after the Sea Peoples vanished from records, their shadow lingered in stories told around campfires and scribbled onto parchment. The irony is rich. A people who left no written record of their own became immortalized through the words of their enemies and descendants. Their legacy isn't just in the cities they burned, but in the myths they inspired, proof that history's greatest disruptions never truly fade. They just put on new masks and step back onto the stage. The mystery of the Sea Peoples doesn't end with their raids, it deepens. After toppling empires and reshaping the Mediterranean, these enigmatic warriors vanished as suddenly as they appeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Where did they go once the dust settled? Why do we find no temples bearing their gods, no inscriptions boasting their victories, not even a single burial site we can definitively call theirs? It's as if they stepped off the stage of history just as the spotlight found them, their final act written in invisible ink. One theory suggests they didn't vanish at all, they assimilated. The Philistines, who settled in Canaan and clashed with the Israelites, may have been the Peliset faction of the Sea Peoples, their Aegean-style pottery and architecture blending with local traditions over time. But what of the others, the Sherdan, the Lucca, the Shekelesh? Some scholars argue these groups simply returned to their homelands, dispersing back into the Mediterranean's mosaic of cultures. A handful of Egyptian reliefs show captured Sea Peoples being integrated into Pharaoh's army as elite mercenaries, their fighting skills too valuable to waste. Yet this only accounts for a fraction of their numbers. The rest slipped through history's cracks, their fate as opaque as their origins. The silence of their material culture is even more bewildering. Most ancient peoples, even nomadic raiders like the Vikings, left behind some trace of their identity, jewelry, weapons, burial rites. But the Sea People's artifacts, if they exist at all, are frustratingly generic. Their horned helmets depicted in Egyptian carvings have been linked to Sardinia based on similar bronze figurines found there, but the connection is tenuous. Pottery shards with spiral patterns could point to Aegean influence, or they could reflect trade rather than migration. Without a Rosetta Stone for the Sea Peoples, a definitive inscription linking their names to a specific place or language, their cultural footprint remains ghostly. This absence has fueled speculation that they were never a distinct culture to begin with. Perhaps Sea Peoples was just a catch-all term for anyone causing chaos by sea, a Bronze Age label for terrorists or pirates rather than a unified ethnic group. The Egyptians, after all, had a habit of lumping foreigners together under ominous labels. If true, their disappearance isn't a mystery but a mirage. They were always a patchwork of desperate migrants, mercenaries, and opportunists, dissolving back into the populations they once raided. Yet the puzzle endures because the stakes are so high. Solving it could rewrite our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse not as a simple tale of invaders versus victims, but as a complex interplay of climate change, economic failure, and human resilience. Every new excavation offers hope, a shipwreck off the Turkish coast, a burial site in Sicily, or a cache of tablets waiting to be deciphered. Until then, the Sea Peoples remain history's ultimate shapeshifters, visible only in the shattered reflections of the empires they left behind. Their story isn't just about what we know, but what we've yet to discover. The Sea Peoples may have vanished into the mists of time, but their legacy is etched into the very foundations of history. They were more than just raiders or conquerors. They were the shockwave that shattered an old world and made space for something new. Think of the Mediterranean after their passing, the mighty Hittite Empire reduced to rubble, the Mycenaean palaces lying in ashes, and even Egypt, though standing, forever diminished. Yet from this chaos emerged innovations that would define the next age: iron smelting, alphabetic writing, decentralized trade networks. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy, they forced reinvention, proving that collapse can be as much a beginning as an end. What's most fascinating isn't just what we know about them, but what we don't. Their silence is deafening. No chronicles, no king's lists, no epic poems boasting of their deeds. All we have are fragments, a name scratched onto an Egyptian temple, a pottery shard with unfamiliar designs, a mass grave hinting at forgotten battles. These gaps in the record aren't just missing pieces, they are invitations. Every archaeological dig, every newly deciphered tablet, every strand of ancient DNA analyzed could rewrite the story. The enigma of the Sea Peoples reminds us that history isn't a static script but a living puzzle, constantly reshaped by new discoveries, and that's what makes their tales so enduring. It's not just about the past, it's about how we understand the past. The Sea Peoples challenge us to question assumptions about migration, about collapse, even about what it means to be civilized. Were they the barbarians at the gate, or refugees fleeing a world on fire? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, in the messy reality where history's villains and victims often wear the same face. Their story mirrors our own era's struggles with climate change, displacement, and the fragility of interconnected systems. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just their doing, it was a perfect storm they rode, just as we navigate the storms of our time. So while we may never uncover the Sea Peoples' true origins or hear their voices speak across the millennia, their mystery is a gift. It keeps history alive, vibrant, and endlessly debatable. What other lost chapters of the human story are waiting to be unearthed? Perhaps the next great discovery lies buried beneath the waves off the coast of Cyprus, or in an overlooked clay tablet gathering dust in a museum vault. The search continues, and with it, the thrill of connecting dots across time. After all, history's greatest secrets aren't just meant to be solved, they're meant to inspire us to